When we open the files of the Illinois State Police for this episode, we're going to enter another kind of crime. It may look innocent, a date with a stranger. You go to a party, picked up for a ride home. But suddenly, like a spider with a web, you're caught and you become a commodity, used for sex or more. It's called human trafficking. The predator is looking for someone vulnerable, perhaps abused at home, looking for love, security, friendship. They use manipulation and physical trauma to control. Hello, I'm Bill Curtis with another episode from the files of the Illinois State Police. State Police. In this episode, we learn how not to get caught in the web, or how to get out. Here's the director of the Illinois State Police, Brendan Kelley.
Welcome to the Illinois State Police Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to the Illinois State Police, as well as the guest that we have as part of the podcast today. And that is a very serious topic, and that is human trafficking. Over the past few years, the Illinois State Police have put a greater and greater emphasis on the investigation and response to human trafficking. Several years ago, working with many of my colleagues around the country and sharing intelligence and information through our Fusion Center and through other professional avenues where law enforcement across the country at the state and federal and local level share information, it became very clear to me that the issue of human trafficking was not just a blip, but was something that was a growing challenge, and that in large part was co-occurring with a great amount of other crimes and other social challenges that we have to deal with as a country, and that really as a law enforcement agency like the Illinois State Police that covers an entire state that has rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas, every type of demographic you can possibly imagine, that we had to really look at what we were doing in terms of countering the very devastating effects of human trafficking. It's consistent with what the Illinois State Police have kind of been shifting over the past few years from less of an emphasis on our traditional traffic enforcement, which we've always done and will always do, but to more and more of a focus away from traffic to trafficking. Gun trafficking, drug trafficking, and now human trafficking. So as we jump into this very important topic, just know that this is really the start of our efforts as an agency, as the Illinois State Police, and that we are really now fully engaged in this effort when it comes to enforcement and working with our partners in social services and other organizations to stop human trafficking and to better serve victims of human trafficking, people that have survived human trafficking. I think as we're getting into this topic of human trafficking, it is entirely appropriate that the first person that we're going to talk to is Kelley Marshall. And I say that because for all the things we discuss on this podcast, it's always important to center the individuals and focus first and foremost on the individuals that are most impacted by the issue that we're trying to deal with in terms of law enforcement, in terms of public safety, in terms of this overall, how we treat our fellow human beings. And in this situation, Kelley Marshall certainly has been a zealous advocate, but also very intimately aware of the importance of hearing the voices of the survivors of human trafficking. So with that, Kelley, why don't you tell us about yourself and tell us a little bit of your story, if you can.
I'm going to start with my childhood because that kind of gives you an idea of where I've come from.
Where are you from, Kelley?
I live in Memphis, but I was born and raised in Miami. And I came from a very abusive household. My father was physically, mentally, emotionally abusive. And the one thing that I heard him say every single day was, "You're nothing and you will never be anything. And so I believed him because he was my dad. My mother left him when I was 10, and so I was bounced back and forth between the two. And at the age of 12, my dad decided he wanted full custody of me. So he went ahead and used my mother's mental health issues in order to gain full custody of me. And so from the ages of 12 to 15, I was also being sexually abused by my dad. And I quickly learned that I couldn't have friends come over because he did the same thing. He sexually abused 3 of my friends and made me watch. Hindsight being 2020, my dad was a pedophile. And I get asked a lot if we ever said anything or if he ever went to jail, but we were so scared and intimidated by him that we never said anything, and he took all those secrets to the grave. And so, if you think about it, traffickers look for those vulnerabilities. And my dad pretty much groomed me to be the perfect target for traffickers because it wasn't my straight A's that made him happy. It wasn't the fact that I cooked and I cleaned every day that made him happy. The only time he was happy with me is when he was sexually abusing me. And so I equated sex with love. That is the one thing that made me like this big target. And so when I was 18, I had my daughter, and my coworkers had invited me to go to a party with them. And my dad was really mad about that. So he went ahead and told me, he said, if you go, don't come back. So I went to the party, came back, got my things. I was working a really good job at the time, and so I had a couple of friends that went ahead and let me stay with them so that I could get on my feet, and which I did. I got an apartment, I got a car, I was doing really well, able to take care of my daughter until one day I had crossed the street and I got hit by a car and sustained some injuries. So here I was, no income coming in, struggling to put food on the table, couldn't pay rent, got evicted. And my daughter and I were sleeping in my car. And so one day my sister pulled up and tapped on the window and she said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, I told you I was being evicted." And she was like, "Oh, okay." And she drove off. And it was at that time that I knew that I did not have any familial support. I had a plethora of vulnerabilities. I was a young single mom. I had already endured trauma from what I went through with my dad. I had no money or very low income coming in. And the biggest thing I really wanted was to feel loved and cared for. I moved to South Beach and we were staying at a hotel in South Beach. And, I was working odd jobs here or there, waitressing, working retail, doing whatever I could. And one night we're sitting in the parking lot, me and my daughter, and this really nice car pulls up. This guy gets out and he is well dressed, fairly good looking. And he walks by me and he says, "Hey, beautiful." Whoa. Like, nobody ever has called me beautiful. We start talking and we're hanging out for the next few weeks and not realizing that this was the grooming process. He acted like my boyfriend and he was helping to pay bills and, pay for our food and our basic needs. But the one thing that really kept me there, kept me with him, was the fact that he was so interested and attentive to my life. He was always asking me questions about me, about my family, about where I was at in life and what I wanted. And I was not accustomed to that because pretty much all of my life I was invisible. And so now that somebody cared and was so attentive to me, I was so naive. I didn't even think to ask him what he did for a living. But one day he said, "Listen, it's time for you to start making money." And I said, okay, I'm doing the best I can. And he said, well, no, I've got something for you. And I was like, okay. He said, do you know what I am? I said, no. He said, I'm a pimp. I said, well, that's good for you, but that's not the life I want to live. And he says, well, you give it away for free, so you might as well get paid for it. And I'm holding my daughter in my arms and I'm saying, no, that's just not who I am. And he looked me right in my eyes. I remember I'm holding my daughter and he said, what kind of mother would you be if you can't even take care of your daughter's basic needs? And I don't know about anybody else, but for me, my daughter was everything. And so there's pretty much nothing that I would not do. At this point, where was I going to go? I had no friends. My family wasn't being supportive. And then I felt like I owed him. And so that night I went out feeling pretty disgusted by the acts that I had to do and making sure he got his money. And by the end of that first night, my thought was, I just proved my dad right. I am nothing, and I'll never be anything. I'm lower than dirt. The next day, we packed up, went to Washington, D.C., because he felt that that's where the money was at. So we go to D.C., and when we first got there, he told me that his cousin lived in Virginia and that she would be babysitting my daughter and that I would see her every day and all of these promises that he made. But I can tell you that in those several months that I was with him, I never saw my daughter. While I was out on the track, one day there was this undercover cop that pulls up and, he's trying to hand me his card and say, hey, if you need help, just let me know. And, the first thing that is like really drummed into our heads or beaten into our heads is don't talk to law enforcement. Law enforcement is the enemy. And if you're caught talking to law enforcement, it is a real big beat down. So this cop tries to hand me his card and I said, are you trying to get me killed? And he was like, I just want to help you. I just want to help you. Over the next few months, every once in a while, he would come by and check on me. I would cuss him out and walk away. And so I took a lot of beatings because I did not make quota very often. And so besides the beatings, I would be made to stay out on the track anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. I would be deprived of food, sleep, water. And there was this one night in particular, I had been out for about 36 hours. It was a Sunday morning. It was really cold. I was freezing and it was raining and there was not a car in sight. And so finally, when one did pull up, I got in. And when we got to the stop sign, his friend jumped in the car. And that's when I totally freaked out. I was like, no, this is not what we do. And he says, I don't think you understand. We're going to a party and you are the party favor. And so we get to the house and there's 14 to 16 other guys there. I've already been crying at this point. And for the next few hours, they did whatever they wanted, with whatever they wanted, in any orifice that they wanted. And it was a very traumatizing experience. But the worst part of it is when I did get back to where they picked me up from, when my trafficker pulled up, I'm thinking, oh, wow, he's going to save me from this. He's going to be loving. But that was not the case. He was livid when he pulled up and got out of the car and started yelling at me, asking me where I've been. And, I told him what happened. And it was really obvious. I mean, I had makeup coming down my face. My hair, which was long at the time, was a hot mess. My clothes were torn. And he said to me, "You mean to tell me you gave it away for free to that many men and you lost money for me?" And he proceeded to beat the living daylights out of me right there in the middle of the street. After that, I saw law enforcement again that went undercover, and he said, "You look really bad. How can I help you?" I'm like, "I don't know where my daughter is." And so he was able to get my daughter. He was able to do what he needed to do. And he said, "Listen, I'm sorry, but there's really no services that apply to your situation, but I would be more than willing to let you come to my house." So I went, and I have to tell you that most of the time when people hear that this law enforcement officer welcomed me into his home, they think that he was expecting something. But I've got to tell you, he never expected a thing from me. He was the first man who ever treated me with respect. And a couple of months of me being there, he asked, did I want to stay in Virginia or did I want to go back home? And so I chose to go back home.
Kelley, I think the key questions that only you can really answer is, why does someone not just walk away? And I think you have answered that, and it's very insidious. It's very manipulative. It's clear that traffickers are very selective about who they are targeting for trafficking. They know exactly what they're doing. It's amazing how sophisticated and psychologically manipulative they are, but they know exactly who to target and when to target them and how to target them and to manipulate those vulnerabilities. Knowing those vulnerabilities, is that why it's so hard for people who are survivors of trafficking to get out of it, to walk away, to find a way out? What are the challenges? And I think you've described them, but why is it so difficult for people that went through what you went through to find a way out?
Well, unfortunately, once I got back to Miami, I met another trafficker. So I was in the life a total of 6 years. People often ask me, why did you go back into it? If you think about it, it's like a domestic violence situation where the victim goes back to her abuser. We believe the lies that they tell us. We believe that they're the only ones that are going to love us. They're the only ones that are going to take care of us. And you form that trauma bond, and the patterns just keep repeating themselves. And you have to think about it. I hadn't healed from what my dad put me through. Then I hadn't healed from my first trafficker. So when it came to the second trafficker, who was loving, who was affectionate, had this outgoing personality, and he was like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and getting to know each other over the next few weeks and thinking this is my boyfriend, and then finding out he's a pimp. He was just like, "I love you. If you love me, you'll do this." We believe that this is all we know. I mean, it is all we know. We don't know anything else. And so it can take several exits before it becomes permanent. It's a long, long journey out. And the biggest thing is having a support system. The reason we stay is because, number one, out of fear. Number two, for me, it was my daughter was used against me. I don't see her for several months. And how am I going to leave if I don't know where she is? They show these images on the internet of being chained up, but that's not it at all. Where we're chained up is up here in our minds. Our thinking becomes totally warped to that lifestyle. And that's why when law enforcement, when they actually approach a victim, they don't know they're a victim. They think they made this choice. And so they have to adjust. And that's what I had to do. I had to adjust to where I was at. Getting out is very hard. One of the things I say to law enforcement is build some trust and rapport with these victims. Show them that you truly care. Let them know, hey, I just want to help you. And you never know how much of a seed that can plant.
I think the things that you're saying make me think of the challenges that we've faced over the past really 30, 40 years in law enforcement when it comes to better understanding domestic violence, for example. It has taken a long time, and I think that shift has been very profound for law enforcement and even the criminal justice system to understand when victims of domestic violence are going to go through the cycle many times. If you're going to break that cycle, you have to be persistent. The same with issues of substance use disorder, people who have drug addictions. People may finally engage in treatment and they try to break out of that cycle, but inevitably there's going to be a relapse. It is such a challenging thing to recognize that someone who is a victim may not outwardly always appear that way because of the choices that they appear to be making, their own decisions that they're making, but it is highly manipulated, either by, in the cases of drug addiction, by the process of being chemically addicted to something, or in the cases of domestic violence, or as you're describing, Kelley, human trafficking, a cycle that has developed, a mindset that has been, in your case and many other cases, literally beaten into someone's mental paradigm. And for law enforcement to recognize that, I think requires a greater level of understanding. And that comes from hearing stories like yours, so we can actually understand the very human side of what a victim of human trafficking is going through, and not to be dismissive and not to be jaded or to be cynical or even, kind of burn out or frustrated with a repeated cycle of conduct and behavior that may, from the outside, be very difficult to understand, but nonetheless is very real and nonetheless is a matter of someone, really, truly being a victim. So hearing you tell your story is so important, and recognizing that it's not just kind of your own self that has to help you out of it. There has to be a whole host of things, and not just law enforcement, but other social services and people that understand this from a very clinical way. We're going to come back to you, Kelley, but I do want to make sure that that perspective of the clinical social worker is something that we talk about here, because it's a really key component of this. Sarah Runyon is the Chief Advancement Officer, and she's a licensed clinical social worker with the Center for Prevention of Abuse, and she's here with us also. So, Sarah, what's your response to the very, moving story we just heard from Kelley? What do you see as someone who's providing support for people who have been trafficked?
Well, first, I just want to thank Kelley for using her voice and being here today. And I think from a support provider perspective, just if I'm looking at the landscape, I see people hiding in plain sight. Just like Kelley was saying, we're not talking about people always being chained up. We're talking about people hiding in plain sight. Heavy, pervasive trauma. I see glimmers of hope, though, in the progress of service providers and their increased understanding of how complex human trafficking situations and recovery can be. I see us getting a lot more requests for training, probably 3 or 4 times the amount of requests for training in the last year or two, as we had been doing. And we've been doing this for a really long time. We've trained 12,000 people over very many years. Also, I see survivors becoming much more visible, using their voices, assuming leadership in this cause, which I like to see. But in terms of trafficking, a lot of what I'm saying, I feel like is really echoing Kelley, and that's who is being trafficked. And it's anyone. It's really anyone. It's anyone, like Kelley said, it's anyone with the vulnerability of being human and looking for love and acceptance. And we talk about vulnerabilities like homelessness and poverty, drug use, lack of support, vulnerable victims. And I've started to really even doing this for a long time, really think about how I look at vulnerabilities, and it can be discouraging because we are talking a lot about the victim and a vulnerability when the reality is a trafficker will find anything to exploit you. And that's the reality, no matter the vulnerability. I mean, we're talking about your 6-year-old neighbor whose vulnerability is just being a child. You know, your cousin, your daughter's friend who ran away from home because of abuse, the woman working at the massage parlor down the street from your office, someone coming to the U.S. for a nanny position, a better life, a woman who met a man on a dating site. It's anyone with the vulnerability of being human.
Are you seeing it in the migrant community as well? That's obviously a vulnerable community that is at a disadvantage in terms of, their legal presence, and that can be exploited.
Oh, certainly. It's definitely a disadvantage. A language barrier is a disadvantage. A lack of familiarity or just overall knowledge of what your rights are, and a trafficker's not going to tell you that, and you don't know what those rights are. Taking your documents, being lied to, misled, manipulated when maybe you're coming here for a job opportunity and then you're not getting paid what you thought you were getting paid, and a trafficker is taking your money, or you thought you'd be sleeping in a bed as a nanny and helping kids, and you're sleeping on a mat in the laundry room and you're not getting paid. So certainly there are disadvantages to that.
Sarah, it seems like such a massive challenge just in terms of human needs. From your perspective, what type of support do people who have been trafficked need? What are their needs? And I think that's important for us to stand, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but just from anybody living in our society, for us to understand what are the needs of those who are being victimized as human trafficking. What are the support mechanisms that can help to slowly but surely break the cycle that they may find themselves in?
It's complicated. I think the first thing is understanding that recovery is hard, it's long, it's complicated, it's complex. But first and foremost, and Kelley talked about this, is just safety and protection, shelter, right? And I think the trainings that we have been doing, I just did one for some police north of Peoria in a smaller town, and the chief asked, I come across these situations, they know a lot about illicit massage parlors, they're investigating those, but he said, local shelters are not able to take the survivors. We talked through why and what that meant. And part of it is because not every shelter has money for trafficking victims. So you might be a domestic violence shelter, but that doesn't mean you can take trafficking victims. And so I think sometimes we think the shelter should be able to take everybody, but the kind of shelter with the safety and protection are those shelters that serve domestic violence, sexual assault victims. And I think that's a really important one. And I think we're really proud at the center for being able to provide that, because we will take labor and sex trafficking victims, no matter whether we get funding or not. It's just a commitment that we've made. But when people come in, the heavy need is shelter, protection, medical care. Medical care is a big one, translation services, but just knowledge, knowledge of what is happening, and not sugarcoating that recovery is hard and it's long, and psychoeducation about what it's going to look like, legal assistance, resources. I think part of it, though, is that it sometimes feels like a Band-Aid, and trafficking recovery, it takes a really long time. You need a very sustainable long-term resources, housing, employment. And I think that's what gets really tricky about survivors, is that a lot of times those resources are not there. So you might have the short-term shelter and some other resources, clothes and food, and all that is great, but it's the long-term resources and ability to commit to housing somebody and helping with transportation and employment. Childcare is a big one, counseling. And really, it's just compassionate, competent support from providers as well.
So obviously the Illinois State Police and a lot of our partners were very much engaged in this from a law enforcement perspective, but we know we're really not successful on any of the issues that we are confronting in terms of public safety and law enforcement without those partnerships that we have on the other side of the issue, social services. You mentioned a little bit about the progress that you're seeing. How is law enforcement doing better, you think? What are the successes? What are we seeing that's kind of helping to slowly but surely, inch by inch, make some progress on this?
Sometimes it's like putting on glasses for the first time, like you're not seeing the progress the whole time until you get at the end and put the glasses on. But I think that training with the police chief and him saying, why is that shelter not taking the clients? And it's not a fault of the shelter, but just him asking that question shows me the effort that he is putting forward in helping folks that he comes across. I think that's progress. That's huge progress. I think involving us in rescues is progress. Offering that victim support, progress. I just hear about the understanding of illicit massage parlors and how they're going about trying to address those things. But I think just the engagement, we do a lot of law enforcement trainings. We get a lot of requests for that. And I think that shows progress.
Do you see the light going on in people's heads sometimes, when you're doing this training? Do you see kind of your burly old crusty cop who thinks they know everything and thinks they've seen it all, and they're just going to do what they do on a regular basis? Do you see some change going on in people's hearts and minds?
Sure, I do. And like I said, I think you see it with the engagement in trainings. I see law enforcement come to the center and want to engage with survivors to move cases forward sometimes. And I see that their demeanor and their attitudes and the words they use are starting to be different in the way that they're engaging survivors in that process, which is really difficult. But yeah, I think just the involvement with the service providers, knowing who to call, an understanding of the service side of it, because we know that they can't solve every problem when they're out there dealing with these things. They have to have people that they can call. And so I think a lot of times the trainings are very helpful because they start figuring out where to go, who to call, and what to do when they encounter these situations.
So voices of the victims, critical, important. Law enforcement, obviously, very big part of this. And it's also broadly various sectors of society that have a role as well. It's not limited just to your do-gooder social service types and your crime-fighting cops. It really is all of us. It's really everybody in our society. And a good example of that is groups like Truckers Against Trafficking. We have with us on our podcast today the Director of Public Sector Engagement for Truckers Against Trafficking, and that's Dylan Wett. Dylan, why don't you tell us what you're doing in this fight?
Absolutely. Thank you, Director Kelley. So Truckers Against Trafficking was formed in 2009, and the whole idea behind it was what population of people could we train that would look for red flag indicators of human trafficking while in the course of their everyday jobs. And we thought truck drivers, they are trained to be vigilant. They are often in places that traffickers will bring their victims, such as rest stops, truck stops, hotels and motels, city streets. And the whole idea is by training this population of people, we can have a whole another set of eyes and ears out there to look for potential sex and labor trafficking. So that has evolved beyond the trucking industry, and we are now working with the bus industry, energy, in-home movers and delivery services, dealerships, shipping and logistics. So anything that touches that transportation sector, we're encouraging these companies and members to train and look for these red flag indicators while in the course of their everyday jobs.
So when truckers see these red flag indicators, what are the steps that they're supposed to take? What do they do if they see one of those red flags?
Absolutely. So if they see, in the case where there may be multiple red flag indicators, such as a case I'm thinking in Virginia where a truck driver saw an RV parked out back by the trucks, he saw multiple men entering this RV. He saw a young woman's face in the back. With these several indicators, he called law enforcement, which is what we encourage, especially when you see a potentially ongoing crime. He contacted law enforcement in the area. Virginia State Troopers showed up, and it ended up being a extremely heinous case of sex trafficking involving a young woman with two adults coming from Iowa to the Virginia area. So to answer your question, we would encourage them to call law enforcement if you are speaking with a potential victim and they need certain services, to reach out to a local service provider or to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but would highly encourage to call law enforcement.
That's outstanding. That's really great that Truckers Against Trafficking, that you are all very much engaged in this. And that's just another example of all the various stakeholders that can make a difference in this. But as is obvious, and as we've been talking about here today, law enforcement has a big role in this. And it's become a major priority for the Illinois State Police. Many local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, people across the country in different parts of the criminal justice system that are involved in public safety are really starting to get what this is and really starting to understand how we have to fight it on multiple fronts, and that this is an effort that involves everyone. But from my perspective, law enforcement has to be a leader on this. We have to be out front, and not just in terms of our views and public policy and engaging in legislation and engaging in combined efforts to make sure that there's right resources for human trafficking, but really operationally, all day, every day, having an awareness of this public safety threat and an awareness of the victimization that is going on, and following through on that with real serious law enforcement investigations and effort. So with that, I'm very glad to be able to introduce one of our special agents. We're not going to say her name. She works undercover in human trafficking in the Illinois State Police Division of Criminal Investigation. She is one of the most impressive criminal investigators I've ever met in the 25 plus years I've been in this world. And just one of the reasons I'm very proud to be part of the Illinois State Police, the work that she is doing and really professionalizing and getting the trade craft of these type of criminal investigations to continuously improve and be more and more effective on a daily basis. So with that, please tell us, Special Agent, what is law enforcement? What is the Illinois State Police seeing in terms of human trafficking?
I would say the victims are vulnerable. They don't come from happy homes. It's not your two-parent household. It typically begins with abuse at a young age. Something while they were young went wrong. It's patterns of abuse, and that's what we're seeing. It's the drug dependency and prior trauma, and it's the children with a lack of strong foundations at home.
How is ISP actively addressing human trafficking?
We conduct a few different types of operations, and Sarah, I think you guys have been a part of a couple of them. Without giving our secrets away in this, I can say that we've made several arrests. We've been successful in every single operation that we've had this far. And I want to say we started this a little over 2 years ago. We put our Trafficking Enforcement Bureau together, and we added some agents to it last year. We've been also working with Homeland Security investigations. So we partner up with them. We follow up on leads that they might send to us or we might send to them. But our unit is small. We have 2 agents up north that are working really hard. They're getting a ton of leads that are coming in. And we also work with our support services. Like Kelley and Sarah said, we can't do this without them.
Well, without, giving away the state secrets here or exposing any operations, how are you investigating human trafficking, and what type of results have you seen in terms of enforcement?
I would say we have been arresting every demographic under the sun. Trafficking doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is. It doesn't matter what your occupation is. We've arrested people from the richest part of the county to the poorest part of the county. It doesn't matter if you're a preacher, you work in a school, you're a truck driver, you work in law enforcement, or wherever. We are getting every types of people during these operations that we're arresting.
Tell us a little bit about those operations.
We're targeting the people that choose to prey on the vulnerable. We're targeting the ones that have probably gone undetected their whole entire lives. Who knows how many times they've done this until they've been caught. But we're also targeting survivors. It's not all about arresting, which I think is the belief of law enforcement. Like, we always have to be arresting someone, but in order to help somebody, it's not always about arresting someone. It's by identifying someone that's been in that situation, trying to find a way out of it. And that's with working with our local support services. because we're going to have a tough time trying to help them if we can't offer them what they're needing, which is, shelter, food, clothing, help with utilities. We can't do that alone.
How, as an agency, and how are you as a special agent, how are you maybe approaching the victim or the survivor of human trafficking differently than maybe several years ago?
I'm going to say we're not going after prostitution charges. We're trying to understand what landed them in that situation and being understanding and what we can do to help in that moment, which it might not be prosecution from the get-go. Something that I have to tell myself so I don't get discouraged sometimes is that it might be the right time for us when we get a lead and we follow up on it and we know who the trafficker is, but all we're needing is that survivor to cooperate with us. It might be the right time for us, but it's not the right time for that survivor to come forward with it. And prosecution might not be what they need at that moment.
So you mentioned prosecution, and so obviously prostitution side of it is very rarely prosecuted now in the state of Illinois, if ever. But there could be co-occurring other criminal conduct that the trafficker has gotten the victim involved in. The trafficker may force the victim to move drugs, to maybe move money around, as part of money laundering, may blackmail them into stealing something for them, go into this gas station and, steal X, Y, and Z from the gas station and bring it out to me, or I'm going to beat you, or I'm going to expose, pictures of you on the internet. Explain how that dynamic is handled and that we're getting a better understanding of and a more nuanced approach in terms of law enforcement, parsing out the criminality that victims sometimes find themselves in and how we might handle that.
I'll give an example. We had a traffic stop by a local PD down south where a female passenger was found to be in possession of several drugs, and then the driver, we later find out that he's been trafficking her. And while, yes, this local PD pulled them over and she has all these drugs on her, we're not going to go and apply for charges and try and get her charged with, drugs when she's disclosing to us that this guy has been trafficking her for all her life, where back in the day, I'm sure, we would have been like, oh, case closed. She has a bunch of drugs on her. She wants to claim to be a victim. We don't think like that anymore. We're getting out of that way of thinking, and we're trying to find out how she ended up with him, who he is to her, what we can do to help her. Again, the drug dependency takes a toll. So we're just trying to find the best way to get her out of that situation.
And I think it's fair to say that in that type of situation, we're kind of hitting two birds with one stone by taking care of the victim of human trafficking. We might get cooperation, not just on the human trafficking case that you're trying to build against the perpetrator, but by treating a victim humanely and trying to get them services and recognize the needs that they have, they're likely to also follow up and be cooperative in the drug investigation, because we know that a lot of the human trafficking and drug trafficking, as well as gun trafficking, is all co-occurring in many of the same circumstances. So, what are the challenges that you've seen in terms of investigating human trafficking and being able to build a case, just from a very basic law enforcement perspective?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate, when we're trying to build the case, one of the most important things for prosecutors is, survivor cooperation. And we might have that initial disclosure to begin with, like they're identifying, but they might be identifying so we can get them some help, and they might not be ready for it to be prosecuted. They might not be ready to sit down. They're in fear that their trafficker is going to find out that they talked to law enforcement, and then they're going to be worried for their lives. And we can never guarantee that a case is going to be prosecuted, even if they do talk to us. So it's something that we can't promise to them. They're worried about, well, this person has technically been also taking care of me while they've been exploiting me, so where am I going to stay? And that's when our local support services come in handy. And I think being able to guarantee that we can have shelter for them, counseling services, groceries, I think that's what's going to lead us into them disclosing more information about what's going on in their life, because it's hard to trust the police. Most people know us for just arresting people. We don't care unless we're arresting someone, but we're trying to swing it toward we want them to get the help that they need so we can get our cases prosecuted. So if we can build that rapport with them, build that trust, and let them know that we're going to look after them by setting them up with these shelters and counseling services, that we truly want to see them succeed and find a way out of that life. I think that's going to be the best way forward to get our survivors to disclose what's going on.
So it sounds like, doing right by victims of human trafficking is not just the morally right thing to do. It's actually good policing. It helps you get the real bad guy and helps us be able to fight crime, which is obviously, what we're all about, and being able to pursue justice and protect public safety. Kelley, we've gone over quite a few things. We've heard from the law enforcement perspective. We've heard from the social services perspective, stakeholders that are part of the public, like Truckers Against Trafficking. There's obviously many other groups that are impacted by this and have a role that's very important. But at the end of the day, it obviously comes back to the perspective of the survivors, and understanding that is what will help us to be able to move forward. Many years ago, now almost 30 years ago now, I spent a summer in Calgary, Alberta, working with a group called Street Teams that was working with the Calgary Vice Squad, dealing with victims of child prostitution from ages of 10 to 18, young females that were at risk or directly involved in that. And I can recall as an impressionable young man trying to understand this dynamic. It was very frustrating, but I can remember that one of the victims, she deliberately elicited a confrontation with her pimp and deliberately and sort of incited him to beat her very badly. It was very compelling to me and very illuminating to me when she tried to explain why she had done that. And it was just to feel anything, even if it was pain, it was feeling something and being reminded that she even was alive, that she even had any sort of humanity at all, even if it was, painful type of existence. It was at least something. It was a feeling. And the reality was so many girls in her situation were going to wind up dead from a variety of sexually transmitted diseases, or just because someone had taken them and they never came back. They just essentially disappeared, or their pimp would beat them to death. The trafficker, as we understand it now, would beat them to death and they would disappear. I think the understanding just how this diminishes someone's value as a person, and how the people that are perpetrating and exploiting this, they see people who are at their lowest of lows and they take advantage of that. That is such an important thing to be able to understand if we're going to ever be able to unravel this. So I think your story, Kelley, is so important for us to hear. But, you've heard from all of us. Any final thoughts from you, Kelley, as we try to continue to do better on human trafficking?
Well, I do have to say that what y'all are doing now, you are learning more about a victim-centered approach. You are doing a lot of the things, but, you talked about just feeling anything. And I know in my case that the only way that I couldn't feel, because I didn't want to feel anything, was by doing drugs. Because I had never done drugs until I got into being trafficked, because I wanted to escape my reality, because I thought it was a reality that was never going to end. I felt like there was no hope in sight. I felt like that no matter what I did, it wasn't going to be good enough. And the one important thing that victims coming into being survivors need is also that mental health component, which is so important, because yes, you can be supportive. Yes, you can be loving. Yes, you can treat us with respect, which is new for us. But getting that mental health aspect in there for their healing process, that is very important. And one of the things that Dylan usually shares during our law enforcement trainings is the fact that just like veterans come back from a war, and they have that PTSD. For survivors, it is the same thing. Once we get out of the life, our mental health is shot. And many of us were diagnosed with complex PTSD because it is so complex and compartmentalized, high anxiety, depression. And these are really important aspects for people to be aware of as well when they are taking care of someone who is involved in trafficking. And, not every victim is going to say, yeah, I really want this help, because they don't know. They don't know what they need. But again, using that victim-centered approach, being kind, saying kind words, treating them with respect. Even if this person continues to go out there and continues on with what they're doing, even though you're trying to help, just, hey, following up with them, checking on them, and maybe, hey, do you need some water? Are you hungry? Do you want something to eat? It's the practical and little things that can make the whole difference in someone else's life.
Was that it for you? What was it that finally tipped the scale to get you out of the life? Was there one thing? Was it cumulative things? What was it for you?
For me, it was my third trafficker who had actually kidnapped me. The last night that I was in the life, it was a massive beating to where he tried to drown me in a bathtub. He tried to set me on fire. He beat me till I was unrecognizable. The law enforcement officers, they did everything right. They got my daughter, and we were in protective custody. Now, I was out of the life at that point and stayed out of the life. But what happened for me is I went into domestic violence situation after domestic violence situation after domestic violence situation because I hadn't healed yet. And it wasn't until someone came to me and talked to me and said, hey, I know you're going through all these different things. And this is my story. So for me, it was getting involved in a church. It took a long time to get me there because I told her, hey, if I go in a church, it's going to burn down for real. And it took her a year of just pouring into me. I mean, I was already going to NA meetings, but there was only so much that the NA meetings could do for me. My relationship with God is what actually started my healing process. And I've been in my healing process for 16 years now. And it's not always pretty, but it's so worth it. And just having that love and support as I'm going through whatever I need to work through, that's the biggest thing.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing so much about yourself and your story. And I hope you know that it is important to hear that. It really does matter for people that are in positions like I'm in, for all of us that are part of this effort within law enforcement, but also within various social services and just, human beings at large. We have to understand that, and the only way we can is for people who are willing to bravely share and expose themselves, really. It's so vulnerable that you're making yourself, but it is for a great purpose, and it really does make an impact in a very, very important way. And let me just, I had one sort of final thought as we wrap it up here. We've been working on this issue of human trafficking for a good 3-4 years, really, and we're making some good progress. We have a long way to go, but recently I took a group of our officers over to Africa, to Ghana, where we did training through the United States State Department International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, where we trained police officers from 4 other countries on issues of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and human trafficking, a lot of gender-based violence. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to go to outside of Accra, the capital of Ghana, a place that was where the original slave trade started. the transatlantic slave trade. And there's essentially, it's like a castle there. This is a place, a fortress where they would round up slaves and bring them and put them on ships for the New World, where they would, if they survived the journey, come to the New World and become slaves. And there's a door there called the Door of No Return, where if you were been captured and you'd been enslaved, you would not be coming back. It has been named the Door of Return now. So many people who are part of the African diaspora, descendants of slaves, they return there. Being there, I realized it's a crime scene, one of the worst crimes in human history. The transatlantic slave trade is probably one of the darkest chapters in all of human history. But I also very much had the realization that we still have a form of slavery in this world in the form of human trafficking. Call it human trafficking. It may not necessarily always look like the bondage that we think of in terms of slavery. And that's not to diminish, the historical realities of the transatlantic slave trade, but human trafficking very much in this day and age is about treating human beings like a commodity, like a thing rather than a person with a heart and a mind and a soul. And we have to recognize that if we're going to put this in the right perspective and gird ourselves to continue to fight against human trafficking, because it is really just one of the most subtle and sinister types of evil that we're dealing with on a daily basis and that we have to continue to devote ourselves to. And so with that, I thank everybody who joined us today. I thank our special agent, who shall remain nameless, as she continues to do her undercover work. I thank you, Kelley. I thank you, Dylan. I thank you, Sarah. And just, again, really appreciate everyone being here again as another part of an Illinois State Police podcast talking about human trafficking. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time.
As we close this file, troopers will be ready to help with your questions. State Police is recorded and edited by Sam Rusink. Original theme music composed by David Huizinga. Produced by Trooper Tammy Wellborn. Remember, good needs to get louder. Until next time, I'm Bill Curtis.